Hello, my name's Doug Bowie. Today we're going to be doing some basic network and workstation diagnostic tool. We'll be exploring the basics of how to configure Windows for IP addresses, specifically for IPv4 addresses, but the basics of how to get there and how it works going to be pretty true for most any network settings that you might need in that context. The second one we're going to demo working with Linux, and this gets a little more exciting because different flavors of Linux have different tools that they use even across the same distribution, such as Ubuntu, which is what we wind up using. So I'll be demonstrating several different ways to do it. There'll be some temporary reassignment where as long as the machine's booted, it'll have those settings, but you reboot it and it goes away. We'll be talking about some more persistent ways to do it, which will be NMCLI and Netplan, which are different ways to do statically assigned addresses or to work with any settings for the NIC, depending on which flavor of Linux that you're using. All right, so we're looking at a standard Windows 10 VM that I'm using as a demo here. Unfortunately, Windows has a number of different ways to get at these settings, and they ultimately all lead to the same place. Changing them will change them for the whole system, but with different iterations, and as Windows has evolved, they've gone through a number of different GUI elements to do this. In our lab context, the easiest way is to just go to the network icon that's on the desktop that I've placed there. And as we click on it, you'll see it's got all three of the different NICs, or however many NICs are in the machine. This is a nice setting. Shows me some information about it. Does it have internet access? What it's connected to? All that kind of good stuff. From here, we can right-click on it and go to Properties, and it'll get us into the settings that we want to be in. Before we go any farther, let me show a few of the other ways to get there, because there are a couple other ways to, quote, skin a cat. If you go to Start and you type Network in the search engine, you'll get the control panel. This is typically the other way to do it. I often go to View Network Status and Tasks, and if we go to Change Adapter Settings, you'll see it brings up the same dialog box. So all I really did was put a shortcut to the desktop for network connections, and that'll get you there. There are a few other ways to do it. Settings has the new Windows 10 way. If we were going to here and into Network and Internet, unfortunately, it tends to show you less information, which is kind of frustrating, as we can go down here to IP assignment, and then we get to work our way through all the GUI doodads that go along. And you can put that kind of stuff in here, but we, of course, miss out on lots of the other settings that might go with it. There are ways to get to those settings. It can take some time. Oh, look, it gets us back to network connections. Surprise. As I said, this is why I put a network connections shortcut on the desktop to make this easier for students. If you're somewhere where you don't have one of those, you may have to work your way through control panel or settings until you can get here to get to that kind of stuff. Windows, by default, an Ethernet card will come up and be set for DHCP. If you don't know what that is, we'll get to DHCP. It's an automatic way of getting an IP address from a remote place that hands out IP addresses, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. When I go into the properties for the NIC, I right-clicked on it, went to Properties. We can see all the different parts of the NIC that are assigned to it, all the protocols and options. We can also configure the NIC itself. Generally speaking, in a lab context currently, we're interested in the IP version, either IPv4 or IPv6. Again, both are set up to automatically pick up an IP address the minute the NIC has a cable plugged into it, either virtually or physically NIC plugged into it, and they'll come up and start looking for an IP address. So they're set to DHCP. So when we click on that and we go to Properties, you'll see Obtain IP Address automatically is already set, as is the same for DNS. It'll go out and get an IP address and a subnet mask and a default gateway, and it'll ask for some DNS servers as well as a number of other things that it may need. And if it gets those things, it'll populate them automatically. And you can see in the background here, I've already gone and done some of that. It's got some of the settings here. You can see an IP address that I got. And if we ran ipconfig all, you'd see, ta-da, NIC1 has, already got an IP address. It'll even tell me my DHCP server, who did I go get that information from, along with, DNS servers and Win servers and stuff we've seen in previous videos. That being the case, we can change those settings, and often we may need to change those settings to static settings. So we check the radio button, that's what these are called in a UI, user interface is a radio button, and we fill in what we need to fill in. We might be filling in 10.101, and I'm hitting period to jump between those, which is not, I just hit tab and you'll see what it did. So sometimes some user interfaces let you tab between the fields, This one's not, like I said, it's an older interface. Just type it and move along. You can hit period between them. It can be a little frustrating to do that kind of stuff. 10.250. And we got to put in a dotted decimal. Some operating systems will allow for a slash notation. You might know /16, right? 255.255.0.0 is a /16, right? 8 ones would be 16 ones. That's where /16 comes from. And we give it a default gateway. 255.254. And so we can give it some of that kind of stuff. We come down and give it some IP addresses. Whoops. I twinkle fingered it. 132. Yes. 235, 9.75. It's universities. We can have an alternate, 235, 200.41. Alternate, and these are the typical kind of settings that we might set. Now, your IP addresses are going to be from whomever's given them. If it's a class, you're going to get them from your instructor or from whatever exercise you're doing. So don't pick them out of the air. That would be bad. You'll need to be, they're very context specific for what network you're on. And if I hit OK, it'll take those settings, and I hit OK again, and you'll notice it'll sort of gyrate here for a little bit and decide that the world is all is right with the world. And it'll eventually pick up those settings up here. Oh, there we go, 10.250, and it picked them up. You'll notice it says we're good, we have an internet connection. The little icon down here in the system tray will show a good internet connection, and that should work. One of the kickers that happens with multiple Ethernet cards in a Windows machine, this is a specific Windows problem that drives me crazy because students run into it all the time. We'll have 3 and 4 and 5 NICs in a machine, and they'll run across it. And I've called it the magical disappearing gateway. This default gateway line, for some reason, will just be blank. You'll have filled it in, you'll hit OK, you'll hit OK, it'll take all of the other settings, and the NIC still won't work. You'll be very frustrated, you'll say, why doesn't this work? And if you go back and check, the gateway line will be disappearing. And of course, you have to have the gateway line to be able to get packets outside the network, so it'll look like it's offline. I highly encourage, every time you change settings in here, to make sure you've hit OK on both of those, let it take the settings, and then go back in and check again to make sure that that default gateway line has filled itself in. I am quite sure it has something to do with having multiple NICs on a machine. You're really only supposed to have one default gateway in a machine, so if you have 5 NICs, only one of them should have a default gateway, and Windows is trying to, quote, help me by removing it. It's very frustrating. Don't do that. Windows, stop helping me. We'll go on from here into Linux to show you some of the Linux ones. All right, so we're looking at a standard Ubuntu 20.04 desktop. Ubuntu 18.04 and 20.04 have had the same kind of user interface and relationship with Ethernet cards. There's an assumption that 22.04 will also, haven't tested that one yet, hasn't dropped yet. So the interesting difference in Ubuntu, at least, is that in Ubuntu desktop, Network Manager is the default choice for how to work with Ethernet cards. In Ubuntu Server, where there's no GUI, it's all command line, they use Netplan, which is a different way to work with Ethernet cards. And we'll go through both of them, talk a little about how they work. In lab, we use Network Manager on both server and desktop. We took our servers and added the Network Manager components to allow it to manage the network. And that way there's only one set of commands to know. And I will go over both those sets of commands here. So for the GUI environment, we're going to come up to this little network card looking thing, or we can pull the whole thing down and go to wired settings and wired connections. And you can see here we've got one NIC on the machine. It would list multiples if they were here. We turn off, turn on, that kind of thing. And we'll go to wired settings. And this should open up a nice GUI that we can look at that will list all of our Ethernet cards. We can turn them off and turn them on, so disable and enable. And we can hit the little gear, which will take us into our settings. And by default, it's going to show us our settings automatically, much like Windows. In Ubuntu desktop, the card comes up, it's already set up to do DHCP. It's assuming that it's plugged into something, and the minute it sees something on the other end of its either physical or virtual wire, it attempts to go and get an IP address, which it has done. And you can see that here in details. And if we go to IPv4, you'll see that it's already set to automatic DHCP, and its DNS and routes are also set that way. However, if we wanted to go set it, we could go to manual and give it an IP address, right? We could say 10.101.10.250, which is what we used previously. And in our net mask, we can use either dotted decimal, so we could say 255.255.0.0 like we did in Windows, or if we know the slash notation, we can just put in 16. And we need to give it a gateway, which will be 10.101.255.254. And our DNS is going to work the same way, where we're going to put in 9.75. Now, in this case, we'll use a comma. It doesn't give it its own field, but we can do comma separated, and that's what the little comment here means. And we hit apply. Now, what's fun is, if you go look right now, you won't see it. It's not there. It doesn't take. Unlike in Windows, where the minute you hit OK, it takes those settings and uses them, you won't see them here. You have to disable the NIC and enable the NIC, and only then are the settings applied. So you can change them to anything you want, but until you've turned the NIC off, turn it back on, it won't apply those settings. Now when I go look, our settings are in place. Very important to remember when working with NMCLI, or actually any of the commands in Linux, is the settings do not take on the fly. You have to turn the NIC off, turn the NIC back on. One of the other things that's worthy of note here is in the settings, how it identifies itself. It identifies the NIC as wired connection 1. That's changeable. It's a string. You can call it anything you want. By default, this is what it'll call it. So when we look at it here in the command window, we can see here ENS33 is connected to wired connection 1. This will become important when we want to go off and use NMCLI to edit with the settings in the NIC. Now, the fun part is there's two ways to do this. So we're going to close all that out, and we're going to make this nice and big. And in fact, we're going to go and make it bigger. And then we'll make it full screen. There we go. So to change Ethernet settings, you have to be an administrator. So I will use the sudo command, and I'm going to start with a command called NMTUI, Network Manager Text User Interface. NMTUI can be run at a command window, right? So even if we're at Ubuntu server, this will still work. I don't have to have the full GUI. This runs inside a command window. And I can edit connections, activate connections, and I can even change my host name if I want to. So I can edit connection. It's going to list the connection. I can come over here and say edit and delete. If I just highlight it and hit enter, it'll let me edit it. And you can see all the same settings that I put in there previously, and I can go in and add manual. And if I hit enter on that, it'll give me a pull down that lets me pick what I want. Go back to automatic if I want, and I can remove things. I'm hitting tab or arrow to go between things, and I can go down here and remove them. And again, I can set all the different settings that I would want. So it kind of gives you an in-between between a very long command line NMCLI, which we'll do here in just a second, and the GUI, which in some cases you just don't have. The kicker is, once again, it's not in play yet until we disable and enable it. And you see the asterisk up here next to the wired connection 1 says that it's active. It's an active NIC. And you can have a whole bunch of them. We hit deactivate, and it'll take it away, and we activate it, and now it's back and up. So we downed the NIC and upped it is what we might call that. If we go out and, NM, and I'm hitting the up arrow, NMCLI, we can see, ta-da, we've gone back to DHCP because the IP address here is not the one we were using before, and it's picked up all those settings. So NMTUI is kind of an in-between, very useful when you're not quite sure how it works or how to make it work. The third way, and I'm going to put some spaces in here so we can see it, the third way is using straight command line. So we'll say things like nm sudo, because it's gotta have sudo to do this, NMCLI, and we'll say connection modification, and then we're going to tell it wired connection 1. We're going to have to reference it by its name, not by ENS, kind of thing. Now, there's a whole man page. There are lots of Google searches that'll get you to this. It is faster to do it this way. If you're working your way through a lot of different VMs, you need to configure them, and you've got notes that have the 4 or 5 commands you're going to need. This will be a lot faster than doing NMTUI to get at it. But it does take a little arcane knowledge to get set up. Press. And oftentimes you can tab complete. That's what I just did. I hit tab, and I'm going to say 10.101.10.250/16. So we're going to be able to give it an IP address and all on one line, and it takes it. And we'll do sudo NMCLI c-m/ and I just hit capital W and hit tab, and it tab completes for me. IPv4, and we're going to say gateway tab complete. Tab completion is your friend. 10.101.255.254, and it's gonna take that. It should give us some errors. We can do up arrows if we want. We can use the up arrow and go back and do things like this, which gets pretty useful. And I want to say DNS, and there we go. 35.9.75. There we go. And I've given it the 3 basic settings that you have to get the NIC moving. One that we haven't given it that we need to tell it, because right now it's set for DHCP, and it's going to keep doing that. So we're going to give it a method command, and we're going to call it manual, which says, hey, switch it to manual. We saw that in the GUI. We saw it in NMCLI. This is how you set manual, and it'll set it to manual. So now we've got the 4 settings that we need. We need to set it to manual. We need to give it an IP address. We need to give it a gateway and a DNS. This should be the basic things to get it to run. How do I down the NIC and up it? There are connections for that. So sudo NMCLI and connection down, and there we go. We're going to down D for down. Should take it down. Successfully deactivated, and we're going to go back. I hit up arrow, and we're going to go back, and we're going to U for up. Bring it back up, and there we go. We should have our settings at that point. You can see it's set all the different settings. I only put 1 DNS entry in, so it only has 1, which is fine. That can be okay if that's what you need. But those are the 3 basic ways in Linux to work with Network Manager. We're going to work with a couple other ways to do it, because frankly, Network Manager is not on everything. There are a number of ways to battle your way through setting NIC settings, and depending on your operating system or Linux distribution, or frankly, which flavor within a distribution that you've got, there's other ways to do it. And we're going to go on and talk about how to do it with Netplan, and I'll also talk about IP, which will allow us to set a temporary IP address on a machine. All right, so what we're looking at here is a standard Ubuntu server VM that I built. And I've logged in as my typical user, and we're going to look at Netplan. So sudo, because to make any kind of changes, I'm going to have to be that. Nano is our text editor, and the Netplan stuff lives in etc Netplan. And there, at the moment, because it's a fresh install, there's only one file there, which is 00 installer config YAML. And we're going to go edit that file. Now, a YAML file started out, I believe, as a Python replacement language. At least that's where I've seen it used in other places before, but YAML has taken on a life of its own. It tends to be very picky about spaces and tabs in it. So if you go working in this, you want to be very aware of that. It will matter how things line up and look and work. And what you're seeing here is the one that is default, which sets it up as DHCP. And you can see here it knows it's ENS33, and it's set up DHCP for true. So in order to change that, we're going to make our own installer config file, and we're going to add the settings necessary to do that for a static IP address. All right, so we'll start off here by just showing the standard settings with IPA, and you can see here we've got 10.101.0.1/16, right? And that works. We can ping, and get to the outside world. So we're able to see things and do things, and if we want to see the route table, we do IP route, which will show us the route table and shows us who we're connected to and that kind of stuff. So it shows that our gateway is 10.101.255.254. So you can see all that kind of good stuff. Name servers get a little more fun. I know there's a way to do it. Netstats not installed by default. That would be typically the way I'd do it. Dig is here, so we can use dig and find that kind of stuff. Dig is a great command, and will show us all those kind of awesome things. This one happens to say server 127.0.0.53. Ubuntu has a tendency to run a local DNS server and do some funky head games with DNS. So getting it to tell you who it's actually using can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, because dig will tend to just reflect the local DNS forwarder, which is a little frustrating. Moving on. So if we were to go look at the settings for the NIC, we would see that we've got a file, ECT Netplan 00 installer conf.yaml. We open it up, we can see this DHCP, it's ready to go. And that's how we get our DHCP. So I've gone and edited that same file so that we can have a little look at it. And this is what the version with static IPs would look like. Now remember, takes a little picky with the spacing in this file and that kind of thing, so it actually took me a little while to work out. But you can see here we've got our standard static IP address that I've been using at 10.101.10.250. We've got our gateway, we've got a name server put in it, and that kind of stuff. And when I do this sudo netplan apply, it will take that YAML file and apply it to the NIC, down the interface, and up it. So it'll go through everything it needs to apply that automatically, and you can see it hesitates here for just a second, and when we do an IPA, we can see those settings have taken effect. 10.101.10.250, and we can go and ping, and it'll go out and find the network and life and that kind of thing. See, it pings here. We can also do the IP route command, and you'll see it doesn't list anything. Well, the default route is listed at the top. It changes the output for it a little bit to change it to default via, as opposed to listing it as a static entry. Netplan is I haven't got a lot of experience with it. It is a typical programmatic interface for needing to bring up lots of little VMs that have servers on them, so we tend to see it in the, quote, cloud a little more often, but it is the standard way to do it in Ubuntu server, so it's worthy of at least being familiar with. Like I said, we typically go and install Network Manager and manage the network on all ours that way. That way we've got one standard way to do it. The last and final way that I'll show is a temporary way to stick an IP address on a machine that will live until you reboot it, and then it'll go away. All right, so this is a situation where you want to set an IP address on a NIC, but you don't want it to be permanent. I just need it up for 5 minutes on this. And this is an unusual case where you won't have to down and up the NIC. You put the setting on there and it's instantly live. It's a little interesting because it's going to add an IP address to the Ethernet card, right? So for DHCP, we've already got one. This will be adding a second one, which is totally legitimate and may be necessary depending on the environment you're in. So I played around with this for a little bit to understand how it worked. And I came up with this command, which is IP. It's an IP command. And it's adding an address, and we have to know the Ethernet card, so we probably have done IPA first to find the name of the Ethernet card. And this will add that IP address directly to that Ethernet card, and it'll be live immediately. So, we do that, and we hit IPA, and now you can see down under ENS33, we can see we've got two IP addresses. We've got the DHCP one that says dynamic out on the right side, and then we've got the one that's 10.101.10.250. Which is also there. If necessary, it's possible to also add route table entries with IP route, add default, and then we need to say where it's going, 10.101.255.254, which is already in our route table, but won't hurt to put it in there again. And if we do an IP route, we can see the route table, and you can see it's in there twice. Once is the dynamic one, and once not. Again, as long as it's in there and going to the same place, it's not going to hurt anything. But it is a little confusing. This is a situation to be handled with care. Very unusual. Might need it occasionally. Again, the minute I down and up the interface, so if I say IP link set dev ENS33 down, it's all gone. Whoops. I've got to be sudo to do it. It's going to be all gone. And when I bring it back up with the up command and I do IPA, those settings are all gone. So they're ephemeral, meaning they're only there for a very little while. I hope this demo has been useful and interesting. Stay tuned for more.